It's time for On Point with Julian Phillips.
Today we're going to talk about justice, what justice means, and are there two forms of justice for people in this country? You know, one for whites and one for people of color. There was a situation not so long ago that you can remember at Emmanuel Baptist Church in South Carolina, where a young man, a white man, Dylan Roof, went in and murdered a number of people, cold blood. He was taken alive. We have another situation recently here, a mass shooting where a person in Georgia was taken alive. Another situation in Boulder, Colorado. I think he happens to be Arab, I believe, but he was wounded, but he was also taken alive. Then you have a situation, and this is just one of many, but it involved no murders, but it involved a alleged $20 counterfeit bill. And George Floyd is dead. Of course, Ahmaud Arbery, we remember that story, just one of many. I just want to go back to that, where he was just jogging through the streets, minding his own business, ran across a house under construction, looked in, walked around, curious, I guess, went out, jogging. He was murdered. Two forms of justice. Right now, Derek Chauvin is on trial. They're calling it the trial of the century. At least that's the latest trial of the century. Day 3 was it yesterday, and we had a number of witnesses testify. They're all basically corroborating what we see on the video. Nobody seemed to understand why Derek Chauvin had to keep his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, a little bit longer, about a minute longer than we originally thought. The defense is trying to paint a case of a man who was full of drugs and an unruly crowd. Now, I'm looking at the video and I see not a big crowd, maybe 10, 15 people? I don't know. I don't see anybody threatening the police. Two forms of justice. The question becomes, will there be justice in this trial for George Floyd and his family? We'll have to see. And will there be justice in some other things that we're going to talk about today, too? And we're going to bring in Eric Ham, and he's going to join us and give his take on what he saw the last 3 days of the trial. And we're going to talk about a few other things. We're going to kind of twine in here to give us an idea of what we face here in America when it comes to our justice system. Eric, good morning, sir.
Good to be here.
So you saw bits and pieces, if not all, of the testimony during the course of the first 3 days. What's your take so far?
Well, I think it was graphic, but also too, Julian, I think the most important thing to come out of this is not only how impactful this entire ordeal has been for Derek Chauvin and for the Floyd family, but also just the emotional toll that it took on a lot of those witnesses themselves. We heard from an underage witness who was there, who still to this day feels guilty because she felt like she didn't do enough to help George Floyd, that she didn't do enough to help him survive. And then she said something so poignant that I think that will resonate with us even when this trial is over. And she said, I realized it wasn't for me to do something for him. It was for him, pointing to Derek Chauvin, that police officer who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. She said it was for him to do something to help George Floyd. And then also the EMT worker who clearly is still, deeply moved by this. And so we see here, Julian, if we're talking about justice, we talk about how this level of justice that has been denied, the level of brutality that was on display by this police officer, this has had a profound impact and will shape people's lives forever based on what they saw in their proximity to what took place on that day. And so I think that's something that we have to recognize. And even when you mentioned the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, I mean, that level of hate, that level of violence that was inflicted upon those people, even though that happened years ago, rest assured that the victims, the survivors, they too are still wrestling with what happened. And so I think when we talk about this, I think we have to recognize just the toll that it takes on people. And that's why when we saw just recently, President Joe Biden announced this massive $2 trillion plan. You know, this is to go towards actually reshaping a nation, because as he recognizes, you know, this is a nation that has been directly impacted by incidents like what we saw at the Emmanuel AME Church, what we saw in Minneapolis last year, and so clearly this is shaping the nation, and there is a need now to purge, or if you will, rewrite how we see these instances of hate that continue to impact the nation, not just people of color, but everyone in this country.
So my question, Eric, is this: you know, we have known for some time now that we live in two spheres of reality. Okay, the reality that we mostly know ourselves, and there's an alternate reality or an alternate universe that has really come to the forefront. And I have to say this: some might question it, that, you know, ever since Trump, there's another reality that exists that is really a false narrative that people are holding on to. For instance, Trump recently came out and said, I think it was on Fox News, that, you know, the protesters, as he called them, we know them as rioters or insurrectionists, were hugging and kissing the police. Now, he can come out and say this, and people will believe it. Just like he said, he could go on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nothing would happen to him. This has become so blatant and so dangerous. And we're going to go into another situation with voter suppression in a minute and talk about that, what's going on down in Georgia, where people are actually believing a reality that is not real. So now we have this trial here, and you have the jurors on it. They broke it down racially, who was there, based upon the evidence and even what the defense is trying to say. I mean, they really have no defense because, as you know, they hardly cross-examined many of these witnesses. And they're basically going on this defense of drug abuse. And then also, of course, that this crowd was unruly. And you can clearly see through the video. So my question is, all you really have to see is the video. I mean, you really don't need the testimony of these witnesses. You can just look at the video. Anybody in their right mind will tell you that this was excessive force on a man who was already apprehended. And the question is, with all of that, with 8 minutes or 9 minutes and 29 seconds of video, will George Floyd's family, will George Floyd see justice? Your thoughts?
You know, Julian, that's a really good question, because oftentimes justice is perceived and seen very differently depending on the lens that you're looking from. For example, you mentioned what took place at the Capitol on January 6th. And now you have a former president and you have lawmakers who were actually there, who were actually witnesses to this tragedy. And they're now painting it differently, suggesting these are people who love police officers, even though a police officer lost his life. But somehow these people there love police officers. Even now, two Capitol Hill police officers are suing the former president. They're saying that somehow these people love the police. So clearly what we are seeing here is something very different, and how you and I looked at what took place on January 6th versus how other people look at what took place on January 6th. We're seeing very different things. And I think right now, Julian, that is one of the biggest problems confronting the nation. We don't have a base parameter from which we actually begin to look at things. The way we lay out our facts are different. The way we see things are different. And so justice, I think, will be it will be very telling what the outcome of this trial will be. I was asked yesterday on air, would George Floyd and his family get justice? And I said, we don't know. We still don't know what the outcome of this trial is. I still look back to Rodney King and those police officers who were also on video brutalizing this man, but yet somehow they were found not guilty. And so even though we have the evidence right here in front of us, even though we can all see with our own eyes, people depending on what lens you're looking from, and we know people of color look at things through a lens very different than those who hold privilege. And so it is very different, and we simply just don't know how this will play out, because again, it largely depends on what view you want and what narrative you want to shape.
Well, we have a bigger audience now in this case than we've had in almost any other case, even Rodney King, which, of course, gained national attention with George Floyd, with all the protests worldwide. The world is indeed watching, and there are bigger consequences for the United States outside of this trial when it comes to human rights in this country. There are consequences when it comes to how we are looked upon and viewed by the world with the human rights violations in other countries. Myanmar, front and center. Why are they going to listen to us when they see us as a country that can't come together when it comes to human rights? We don't have that moral authority that we once had as the world's #1 democracy. So we'll see on that. But let's fast forward. I mean, obviously this will play out, and we'll see what it'll be. What it'll be. But we are also witnessing justice when it comes now to voting rights. Throughout the history of this country, every time people of color gained ground, then there was always something to suppress it. Jim Crow being, front and center, voting suppression. We're seeing it now in 2021, where a race was deemed not fraudulent at all, but yet and still you've got 250 bills in 43 states that are looking to change the laws. In Georgia, front and center. They're talking about things just as outrageous as not being able to give water and food to people who are standing online. This is so outrageous and egregious to me that I don't see how any lawmaker can sit there or stand at a press conference in a straight face and have anybody think that this is the right thing to do. Justice, once again. Justice denied for people who are trying to do the right thing, who are galvanizing to vote. And here we have this. Eric Ham, what do you say?
Julian, what we are seeing is what we have seen play out for centuries in America. Because quite frankly, we have seen a nation develop itself around a lie that people of color, namely Black people, at one time were not considered human. We were not even considered a full person. And so that was based on a lie. And as a result of that, it became policy. It became the law of the land. It became how we engaged with one another, because people of color, particularly Black people, were seen as inferior, as not human. And we still today are fighting for that level of humanity. When we look at, in the case of George Floyd, we have seen witness after witness say that Derek Chauvin, even after the pleading with people there, continued to place more of his weight, not less, on the neck of George Floyd. We saw George Floyd in the store interacting with people. The store clerk even said, I asked him if he was a baseball player. I talked to him. He recognized his humanity. But what this police officer did was he didn't see that. In fact, the defense attorney, one of the key threads that we heard from him when he was questioning a witness was the witness angry? And then he talked about, was George Floyd angry? Suggesting that somehow if Black people become angry, that is menacing and that is threatening, and therefore you should be void of your humanity, and therefore you should be treated in a brutal fashion. Well, and so that's what we continue to see over and over. Just like what took place on January 6th, Senator Ron Johnson, the anger and savagery and vitriol that we saw by a largely white audience, that was okay to him. But what he specifically said, if that were Black Lives Matter, I would have been threatened. So we see here, Julian, something very different, and it has played out for centuries, and it continues to play out.
So the key word here is humanity. And yes, it has played out for centuries. I can point back to the 20th century during the era of the Third Reich in Germany. And what did Hitler do to demonize Jews in that country primarily? He basically pictured them and placed them as less than human. Measuring skulls, the size of noses, all sorts of things, caricatures that were put in books and magazines. So therefore, it became easy psychologically, I guess, for folks who wanted to believe Hitler, or at least he was trying to lure, to say, okay, well, these folks aren't human. Well, it's the same thing with people of color in this country. They are not humans. The Vietnam War, Vietnamese, their nickname, and for those, who are our audience, I'm just saying, with gooks. I guess it's easier to inflict pain and brutality on a group of human beings who you feel are less than human. So I guess my question is, we've come to a point of justice. There is justice for some people who believe that they are human, and there's another form of justice for those who believe that other people are not human. And I guess the point of it is, Eric, how do we get to a point where people who hate one another unjustly can get to a point where we treat each other at least as human beings, where even if we don't like each other, we can respect each other under the rule of law that exists for all of us. And we're talking specifically here in the United States of America. How do we get to that point once again, if we ever get to that point?
Well, Julian, it comes down to what you just said, and that is under the law, under this democracy. And right now, this is a nation that is at battle with itself to determine if, in fact, it is a democracy. Because what we see, even from lawmakers, is this push for something that's autocratic, that's authoritarian, that's dictatorial even, not necessarily a democracy. And what we are seeing is people who feel as though they are losing their place in this country, and therefore they are prepared, willing to act on destroying this democracy if it means a power dynamic will continue to exist in this country. And so that's what's at stake right now.
Well, there is a lot at stake right now, justice, and we're seeing it in many platforms here in America. And I would dare say that, we are at a crossroads, but a very serious one, where we will decide whether or not we truly are a democracy and a place of justice for all people or not. We're going to keep our eyes on this. The Chauvin trial is supposed to go on for 3 or 4 weeks. And obviously, this whole thing with voter suppression, we didn't get into, of course. Now the big businesses are coming forward, Delta, Coke, others against and protest to what the Georgia lawmakers have put in law now to change the vote. But we'll talk about that as we go along. Go ahead.
Just to point out on that, again, this is, again, another lie. We talked about this big lie that's been perpetuated for centuries throughout the foundation of this nation. And now this voter ID law that has passed in Georgia and that we see now coursing through other state legislatures, it is, again, perpetrated on a lie that somehow there was massive fraud in the 2020 election, which President Trump's own attorney general said did not exist. The Supreme Court said did not exist, and courts all across the country said did not exist. And so, again, what we see here are policies, laws being enacted, pushed through based on lies. And Julian, as you and I both know, anything that's built on a lie cannot stand.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's hope that it won't. on this particular case, because the law has been written. Now it's up to the people, to businesses and others, to put pressure on to perhaps change this, and also see what the federal government will it be able to do to turn the tide on all this, especially in Georgia, but all these other states where there are lawmakers that are trying to change the laws. Eric, it's always great talking to you. You hate to leave on a negative note. But, as I always say, I do believe in hope, and, I do believe hope springs eternal. We will see how all this plays out, but we'll have plenty to talk about in the weeks to come. So thanks, and we'll see you next week.
You bet. Thanks, buddy.
Justice. Is there one form of justice? Well, in the books it's written that way, but is there really one form of justice for all of us, for human beings? When the issues of hate come up, all sorts of things apparently come into play. We can only hope that with our system of democracy that justice will prevail for all of us. But again, with it like anything else, righteousness comes at a price. It usually comes at a heavy price, but righteousness does win out in the end, as far as I have seen, and I'm going to continue to believe that. As we move forward with On Point again, we're going to expose these issues, and we're going to dig deep into them and try to find different perspectives that people can at least think about and ponder over, so all of us can come to a point where we can live together. The one thing that I want to see in this country, in this world, is all people coming together. This is not a gotcha situation, this person over that person. You would think in 2021, with science is where it is, and we've been to the moon and back and all sorts of things like that, that people still have hate and disbeliefs about people based upon color. Human beings, are we still that primitive? Really? I guess we are for a number of people. But hopefully, with pressure and with education and with kindness and with consistency of truth, we will be able to see a better day. Anyway, we have a lot to focus on in the coming weeks. And as Martin Luther King says, there are going to be some difficult days ahead, but we're going to try to see if we can kind of dissect things and provide hope and meaning for people who want to see positive change. And on that note, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.